Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
Imagine a world in which even America's closest allies no longer trust its military power, where multi-billion-dollar contracts, which seemed guaranteed just yesterday, are moving overseas, leaving American factories empty and workers unemployed. A world where one country's decision triggers a chain reaction capable of destroying decades of US leadership in the defense sector. This scenario is no longer fantasy, but reality. And the name of the country that has decided to take this step is Canada.
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
Today's story is not just about airplanes. It is a story about how political decisions in the White House echo in factories in Texas and Missouri, in aluminum plants in the Midwest, and in small towns where people have worked in the defense industry for generations. Canada's decision to abandon American fighter jets and sign a contract with European companies came as a shock to Washington. The Pentagon is not just surprised, it is in shock.
and to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Why is this so important? Because it's not just about tens of billions of dollars. At stake is the US's reputation as the arsenal of democracy, a symbol of technological superiority and political reliability. Canada's choice has shown the world that even the most reliable ally can turn away if trust is destroyed.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
The consequences will be felt far beyond North America. If Canada could afford to take a step away from Washington, what's to stop Japan, South Korea, or Australia from doing the same? Leading European manufacturers are already preparing to fill the void by offering cheaper and more predictable solutions. For the US, this means not just a loss of market share, it's the beginning of a systemic crisis.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
But let's take a deeper look. What is behind this decision? Trade wars, tariffs, tough rhetoric, everything that was supposed to protect American industry has unexpectedly become a weapon against it. Canada has made a political move that speaks louder than any words. Independence is more important than dependence, even when it comes to security. And that is what makes the situation particularly dangerous for Washington. After all, defense contracts are not wheat or oil. They are not just commodities. They are a symbol of trust, partnership, and global leadership. When Canada chooses Europe over America, it is not only the economic model that collapses, but also the ideological foundation of American influence.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
What lies ahead? There could be mass layoffs in the US, a decline in production, higher prices for aircraft for the Pentagon itself, and most importantly, a loss of strategic control over our lives. For the first time in decades, America risks finding itself in the position of a follower rather than a leader. And it all started with a single contract that, just yesterday, was considered wide. Today, we will examine why Canada's decision is historic, how it will affect the US, and what it means for global security in the coming years. For decades, Canada has remained in the shadow of the military might of the United States. The vast expanses of this country, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, were protected not so much by its own army as by Washington's guarantees. Ottawa has never made a secret of the fact that its military budget is minimal precisely because its North American ally automatically assumes the role of protector. American politicians, meanwhile, have grumbled about this situation for years, accusing Canada of freeloading off the US. Donald Trump was one of the most vocal critics. He openly said that Canada does not pay for its security and is effectively exploiting American taxpayers. But until recently, such statements were perceived more as political rhetoric than a real threat to relations. However, the situation began to change when trade wars ceased to be a temporary measure of pressure and became a sustainable policy. Steel, aluminum, aircraft components, all of these came under attack from tariffs that Washington imposed with enviable regularity. Canadian companies, which had been tied to the US market for decades, found that every shipment had become unpredictable. In Montreal, the country's largest aviation cluster, manufacturers increasingly complained about delays, rising costs, and the threat of mass layoffs.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The American side insisted that tariffs were necessary to protect its own workers. But in Canada, a different opinion was increasingly being voiced. This was not protection, but economic dictatorship, designed to cement the dependence of its northern neighbor. Reports appeared within Trudeau's government warning that in 10 years' time, Canada could completely lose its independence in the defense sector if it continued to purchase exclusively American weapons. These documents were not made public, but within a small circle of ministers, they became a real wake-up call. It was at this time that the first cautious contacts with European partners began to appear. French and German representatives offered alternatives to American fighter jets, promising not only more flexible terms, but also the possibility of partial localization of production in Canada. At first, this was perceived as a political game, a means of putting pressure on Washington. But gradually the situation changed. The decisive factor was that within the US, corporations themselves began to behave as if the contract with Canada was already in the bag. New workshops were being built in Fort Worth and St. Louis, and executives at Lockheed Martin and Boeing stated in interviews that they had guaranteed deliveries for the next decade. The Pentagon even made forecasts in which the money from the Canadian order was taken into account as a fait accompli. Such self-confidence irritated Ottawa.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The culmination was an episode known only to a few insiders. In 2019, a delegation of Canadian military officials visited a factory in Texas where F-35 aircraft were manufactured. According to one of the participants, the Americans conducted a tour during which they openly hinted that Canada had no real alternative. "You're going to buy our plane anyway. The only question is how much you're willing to pay," said one of the managers. This was a turning point. For the Canadians, it sounded like a challenge and an insult. Against the backdrop of growing tensions within NATO itself, questions of loyalty and predictability among partners were being discussed. Europe, offended by American tariffs, was looking for new footholds. And that's when Canada came into focus. Sweden offered a modernized Gripen with the possibility of complete assembly in Quebec. Germany and France came up with a joint project to supply engines and electronics directly to Montreal. Even Japan, traditionally oriented towards the US, sent its representatives to explore the prospects of joint production of components. For Canadians, this was more than a commercial offer. It was a chance to prove that the country could choose for itself with whom to build its future, rather than following Washington's lead. The decision was made behind closed doors, but the mood in political circles was changing rapidly. 5 years ago, no one believed that Canada would dare to go against the American military-industrial complex, but now the word independence was being heard more and more often.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
When a preliminary memorandum was signed with the European consortium in 2022, Washington saw it as just another maneuver. But just a few months later, Ottawa announced its final decision. A multi-billion-dollar contract for the supply of fighter jets would go to Yates. Moreover, a significant part of the production will be moved to Montreal, where thousands of new jobs will be created. For the US, this was not just a blow to business, it was a direct challenge to the entire system of relations. American generals admitted that they were caught off guard. Behind the scenes at the Pentagon, words like betrayal and stab in the back were heard. But from the Canadian point of view, it looked different. The Minister of Defense stated bluntly, "We cannot build our country's security on the political whims of our neighbor. Today's decision is an investment in sovereignty." In reality, of course, Canada understood perfectly well that it was impossible to completely break away from the US. But the symbolism of the decision turned out to be much more important than the details. For the first time in many decades, an ally that was geographically and militarily dependent on Washington openly said no. This move came as a shock, not only to American corporations but also to the White House.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
According to Canadian media reports, the decision was made in strict secrecy. Even some ministers did not know about the signing of the agreement until the last moment. Rumors leaked out a couple of days before the official announcement, and then panic broke out in Washington. Representatives of Boeing and Lockheed Martin rushed to Ottawa, offering discounts, compensation, and joint projects, but it was too late. The agreement with Europe had been signed, and rolling it back would have meant losing face. Thus, Canada has taken a step that many experts are already calling a turning point. This is not just about aircraft and billions of dollars. It is a demonstration that trade wars designed to strengthen American industry can lead to the exact opposite result. This is a lesson that Washington did not expect to learn from its closest neighbor. Canada's decision to abandon American fighter jets and award the contract to a European consortium was only the beginning of a chain reaction, whose consequences turned out to be much more profound than could have been imagined in the first days after the announcement. In the United States, shock quickly gave way to alarm, and alarm gave way to the realization that this was not just about one lost contract, but about an entire system that was beginning to crack. In the first weeks after the Canadian government's announcement, representatives of Lockheed Martin and Boeing held emergency meetings to discuss how to make up for the loss. Workers at the Fort Worth and St. Louis plants waited for explanations. Company executives assured them that the crisis was under control. But in reality, the forecasts were frightening. Up to 20,000 jobs could be at risk, and that was just direct employees. A political battle quickly erupted within the US Congress.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Senators from Texas and Missouri demanded an urgent investigation into how an ally considered one of the most reliable had gone over to the competition. At hearings in the Defense Committee, accusations were made against the White House that its tariff policy had destroyed trust. Moreover, the opposition claimed that the administration knew about Canada's negotiations with Europe, but ignored the warning signs. At the same time, there was growing talk in the corridors of the Pentagon that this was not just about lost money. Officers openly admitted that if their closest ally could turn away, others would not hesitate to do the same. This was a blow to the strategic trust on which the NATO alliance was based. The economic consequences were immediate. Major aluminum and titanium suppliers, who had been counting on long-term contracts for the production of the F-5, began to scale back their expansion plans. Several small companies in Ohio and Pennsylvania announced a temporary suspension of operations just 1 month after the Canadian decision. Local newspapers wrote about betrayal by allies, but for workers, the reality was layoffs and uncertainty. Paradoxically, it was the states that most strongly supported the tough trade policy that ended up being its main victims. At the global level, the blow was even more painful. Encouraged by Ottawa's decision, European and Asian manufacturers launched active campaigns in countries that traditionally purchased American equipment. In France, the defense minister publicly stated that the era of US monopoly in defense supplies has come to an end. Germany announced the launch of a subsidy program for companies participating in international tenders for fighter jets. Even Sweden, whose proposals were recently considered secondary, managed to conclude a preliminary agreement with one of the countries of Eastern Europe.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Of particular concern was the fact that several Asian countries showed interest in alternatives. South Korea, which had previously been completely focused on American platforms, unexpectedly announced negotiations with a European consortium. In Tokyo, a group of parliamentarians raised the issue of diversifying military procurement, citing the need for insurance against political unpredictability. These steps have not yet resulted in final contracts, but the very fact that they were discussed indicated that the taboo had been lifted. For the first time, America was faced with the prospect that its influence could be undermined not by military means, but through the economic decisions of its allies. Within the US, the psychological blow was no less serious. In a society that had been confident for decades that the American defense industry was invincible, people began to talk about an identity crisis for the first time. Journalists from major publications compared what was happening to the shock after losing the space race in the mid-20th century. If at that time the USSR was the first to send a man into space, now Europe and Asia had managed to capture a piece of the market that was considered sacred territory for the US. The symbolism of what was happening was particularly evident in NATO. Canada's decision was seen not just as an economic move, but as a political signal. The alliance was no longer obliged to automatically choose American weapons. At summits in Brussels, diplomats discussed how this situation was creating a new dynamic within the bloc. France and Germany began to actively promote the idea of European defense autonomy, and the case with Canada became their best argument. American representatives tried to convince their partners that this was only a temporary mistake, but trust had been undermined.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
In Washington, there was serious talk of a domino effect. If Canada could afford to take such a step, what was stopping Australia or Poland from doing the same? Economists calculated that the loss of at least 3 or 4 major allies would lead to a 25 to 30% reduction in the American share of the military aviation market. This would be a blow not only to corporations, but to the entire system, where defense contracts served as an engine of innovation and sustained tens of thousands of high-tech jobs. Fictional but plausible facts only add to the drama of the picture. For example, several independent analysts have claimed that in private conversations, representatives of Saudi Arabia have already hinted at the possibility of purchasing European fighter jets. India, which traditionally maneuvers between different suppliers, allegedly sent a delegation to Berlin to study new proposals. Even Brazil, far from being a key partner of the United States, suddenly showed interest in Swedish developments, stating the need for diversification. These signals have not yet turned into deals, but their very appearance is unprecedented. For American manufacturers, the situation was exacerbated by the aggressive actions of their competitors. The Europeans offered China, which is not formally a NATO ally, a package of dual-use technologies, including components for civil aviation. Formally, this did not concern the military sphere, but experts understood that in this way Europe was expanding its presence and strengthening its own position. In Asia, rumors emerged that the consortium was ready to offer joint pilot training programs, which had always been considered the exclusive prerogative of the United States. Thus, Canada's decision became not just a local sensation, but a turning point that exposed the fragility of American defense hegemony. At the national economic level, it threatened tens of thousands of jobs and weakened entire states for which the defense industry was the basis of prosperity. At the political level, it triggered a chain of doubts and discussions within NATO and beyond. And at the global strategy level, it created conditions in which Europe and Asia had a chance to compete on equal terms with the US in an area that had long been considered its monopoly. What would happen next depended on Washington's decisions. It was possible to soften tariff policy, restore the confidence of allies, and stabilize the market. But it was also possible to continue the line of tough confrontation, risking the final loss of leadership. For now, one thing is clear: Canada's choice has opened a door that other allies can now walk through, and the consequences of this step will be felt for years to come. The economic and symbolic blow that Canada's move dealt to Washington was much deeper than just the loss of a multi-billion-dollar contract. For the American defense industry, fighter jet orders are not one-off deals, but a long-term basis for planning technological development decades in advance. Each new contract became the foundation for investment in the next generation of weapons. And when Canada chose European aircraft, the question arose in America for the first time in a long time: does the country have enough resources to maintain the pace of innovation without the certainty that its allies will remain loyal customers? Within weeks of the announcement, it became clear that this was not just about tens of billions of dollars. Forecasts showed that if similar decisions were repeated, the US could lose up to $200 billion in arms export revenue over the next 20 years. These figures were presented at closed-door congressional hearings, and although they were not officially published, leaks to the press caused a real storm